You think you know intimidation? You've seen claws, fangs, bioluminescent displays. But what if I told you the most terrifying thing in that academy hall wasn't some 7-foot reptilian cadet? It was a small human female unzipping her collar. When Maya Torres revealed that throat tattoo, the entire room went dead silent. Not one laugh, not one scoff. Just pure primal fear. You know what they thought when humans first arrived at the Galactic Military Academy? They saw them as maintenance crews, maybe support staff, certainly not as real cadets. I know because I was there. Corex, Xanthari Observer, 3rd Class Intelligence Liaison. My job was to assess new species integration, and when the humans stepped off that transport, I marked them down as borderline cases. Too few limbs, no natural armor, minimal threat displays. They looked like administratives who'd wandered into the wrong briefing. 5 cycles passed since their admission. The mockery never really stopped. It just became part of the Academy's background noise. You'd hear it in the mess hall during training exercises, even in tactical briefings. Cadets from species with retractable claws or venom sacs would flex and posture. Humans would just stand there taking notes. They became the Academy's favorite punchline, the 2-armed curiosities who brought what they called diplomacy to a combat training facility. The social hierarchy here runs on very specific metrics. Arm count matters. Visible biological weaponry matters. A Retharian cadet with 6 limbs and acid glands will always rank above a human with their opposable thumbs and upright posture. The system rewards traditional intimidation displays. It's built to measure what we've always measured. Physical dominance, overt threat signals, the kind of posturing that works in intraspecies conflict. I dismissed them myself in my initial assessment. Wrote them off as fragile temporary additions to the program. They lacked the fundamental requirements we associate with military capability. Their movements seemed inefficient, their bodies appeared vulnerable. I documented their calm demeanor as a weakness, not a tactical choice. This cultural confidence created a perfect environment for miscalculation. We were so sure of our evaluation methods that we never considered they might be measuring something entirely different. Alien cadets operated on assumptions that had never been seriously challenged. We judged based on physical presence, biological advantages, visible weaponry. The idea that a species might develop intimidation through completely different channels never crossed our minds. The stage was set for a confrontation nobody saw coming. On one side, centuries of established military tradition and evaluation standards. On the other, something new. Something that didn't play by our rules. Something that had quietly been studying us for 5 cycles while we laughed at their lack of claws. That's when the human female decided to speak without saying a word. Her fingers went to her collar and everything we thought we knew about intimidation began to unravel. Why did we think our displays were superior? Because they always had been. Xanthari intimidation relies on complex bioluminescent patterns across our epidermal layers, combined with multi-limb posturing, that creates an imposing silhouette. The light patterns shift through threat gradients. Amber for warning, crimson for imminent engagement, ultraviolet for lethal intent. It's an elaborate dance that works perfectly against other Xanthari. We read the subtle shifts in hue and limb positioning like you might read facial expressions. The problem is it only works on us. These displays evolved for dominance battles within our own species, not interspecies psychology. They're a closed communication system. A Retharian sonic vibration display might terrify another Retharian, but to a Xanthari it just sounds like unpleasant noise. A Crevian's expandable frill and pheromone release signals mortal challenge to its own kind, but other species might miss the chemical cues entirely or find the visual display merely curious. We all developed our threat languages in isolation, then assumed they were universal when we met other species. The Academy curriculum reinforced this arrogance. Instructors scored cadets on how effectively they deployed species-specific intimidation techniques during exercises. A high score meant you projected dominant biological signals, more limbs extended, brighter bioluminescence, stronger pheromone concentrations. The evaluation sheets had checkboxes for traditional displays, nothing for alternative intimidation methods. The system measured what it understood, and it understood physical demonstrations. Human calmness got consistently misread. When a human cadet remained still during a confrontation, instructors marked it as failure to engage. When they didn't respond to posturing, it was noted as inadequate threat response. Their quiet assessment looked like hesitation. Their analytical pauses registered as vulnerability. We saw controlled evaluation as lack of capability. This created a massive blind spot in our threat assessment protocols. We were trained to recognize certain signals: the flare of membranes, the extension of claws, the release of combat pheromones. A species that didn't use any of these methods simply didn't register as threatening. Our sensors weren't calibrated to detect their particular brand of danger. We built entire evaluation systems around recognizing the threats we knew, ensuring we'd miss the ones we didn't. The entire institution was structured to validate traditional intimidation methods while filtering out anything that didn't fit established parameters. It was like having a communication device that only receives one frequency while missing all other transmissions. We were listening for roars and missing the whispers. We were watching for explosions and missing the slow burns. Then Maya Torres unzipped her uniform collar. The sound was barely audible, but in that moment it was the only thing worth hearing. What did her appearance hide? Maya Torres stood a full head shorter than most cadets in her intake group. Her frame lacked the bulk of the Retharians, the extended limb structure of the Zenthari, or even the dense muscular development of the Crevians. She presented as physically slight, almost fragile by Academy standards. No natural armor plating, no retractable claws, no venom delivery systems, just a standard-issue uniform on what appeared to be a standard-issue human form. Her physical presence suggested logistics, not frontline deployment. Her quiet demeanor reinforced this initial impression. While other cadets practiced aggressive corridor navigation, claiming space with widened stances and deliberate posturing, Maya moved with economical precision. She didn't swing her arms to establish territory or flare membranes to assert dominance. She simply went where she needed to go, often along the edges of thoroughfares rather than through the center. This wasn't interpreted as tactical efficiency. It was read as social timidity. Classmates noted her consistent absence from traditional pre-combat rituals. While Retharian cadets performed sonic harmonization exercises and Zenthari engaged in bioluminescent pattern synchronization, Maya would often be observed reviewing datapads or performing maintenance checks on equipment. She didn't join the group intimidation practices before simulations. This non-participation was logged as failure to integrate rather than alternative preparation methodology. Even her uniform seemed to work against any imposing image. The standard issue gear appeared slightly oversized on her frame, the sleeves extending past her wrists, the collar sitting higher than on broader-shouldered cadets. This had the effect of emphasizing her physical slightness rather than concealing it. Where bulkier cadets filled their uniforms with muscle mass, her gear seemed to swallow her form. The visual message was clear. This individual occupies less space than others. This presentation systematically reinforced every assumption we held about human fragility. Each interaction widened the gap between perception and reality. When she declined challenges to physical competitions, it confirmed her weakness. When she avoided dominance displays, it evidenced her inadequacy. The more she failed to conform to our understanding of military presence, the more certain we became of our assessment. We were measuring the container without considering what might be inside. Her entire presence functioned as a masterclass in strategic misdirection. She showed us exactly what we expected to see from a species we considered physically inferior: the quiet movement, the non-confrontational posture, the absence of traditional intimidation signals. All of it played perfectly into established prejudices. We were so busy evaluating what was visible that we never considered what might be concealed. However, the truth was waiting just beneath the fabric. Not hidden in some deep psychological sense, but physically present under the uniform itself. The standard collar hid what she chose to reveal only when revelation would have maximum impact. The oversized sleeves concealed hands that could perform precision tasks we hadn't yet imagined. The entire presentation was a calculated interface designed to provoke specific reactions while preserving actual capability for moments that mattered. How does fabric changing positions silence predators? The sound starts small, just the faint metallic rasp of a zipper pull moving downward. Maya's fingers went to her collar during a lull in the mockery. A casual motion that seemed almost incidental at first. She didn't make a production of it. No dramatic stance, no aggressive posture, just the simple mechanical action of a garment opening. The movement carried such ordinary purpose that most cadets barely registered it initially. They continued their taunts, their laughter still echoing through the hall. The sound of their own voices covered the first few centimeters of zipper descent. Then the chatter began to fade. Not because anyone gave a signal or called for silence. The change happened organically, one cadet at a time noticing something wasn't right. The zipper sound became audible as the noise level dropped, a sharp, precise metallic click with each tooth separation. The rhythm was too deliberate, too controlled for accidental exposure. This wasn't someone adjusting their uniform. This was purposeful revelation. First, one Retharian cadet stopped mid-laugh, his frill still partially extended. Then a Zenthari observer cut off their bioluminescent display pattern. The silence spread through the hall like a wave, each cadet turning to watch as Maya continued the slow, measured descent of that zipper. Her movements held none of the hesitation we associate with uncertainty. Each motion was precise, economical, and utterly controlled. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't pausing for effect. She was simply executing. The theatrical nature of the act became undeniable. This was performance, but not in the way we understood performance, not the dramatic posturing of species-specific threat displays. This was something colder, more calculated. The simple garment mechanism became the most terrifying sound in the hall because everyone realized it wasn't about the fabric. It was about what the fabric concealed. The zipper wasn't just opening clothing, it was revealing intention. Predators understand concealment. They understand the moment before the strike, the instant when hidden capability becomes visible threat. But this was different. This wasn't biological weaponry being unveiled. This was something cultural, something symbolic. The cadets recognized the significance even without understanding what they were seeing. The silence grew heavier, more profound. Every eye tracked that descending zipper, waiting for what would emerge from behind the standard issue fabric. Then the ink became visible. First just the top edge, black against skin. The design emerged gradually as the zipper continued its descent, revealing more of the artwork with each centimeter. The pattern wrapped around her throat, positioned exactly where major arteries lie closest to the surface. The placement was too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be decorative. This wasn't body art chosen for aesthetic appeal. This was messaging. The silent hall now held its breath, waiting to understand what message was being delivered. Why does a bone image frighten bone breakers? The tattoo emerged completely as the zipper reached its full descent, a human skull rendered in precise black ink wrapping around the front of her throat. The positioning was absolutely deliberate, placed exactly where the carotid arteries run closest to the surface. This wasn't decorative body art chosen for aesthetic appeal. This was strategic placement. The design sat at the most vulnerable point on her entire body, the place where a single precise strike could end life instantly. The skull design itself carried significance beyond mere representation. Every species that develops internal skeletons recognizes skull structures. The empty eye sockets, the nasal cavity, the tooth row. These features translate across evolutionary lines. A Retharian might have 4 eye sockets and serrated dental plates, but the fundamental concept remains identical. Bone structures mean mortality. They signify what remains when life departs. The image transcended cultural specificities because every species present understood death. The artwork quality indicated professional application rather than amateur decoration. The lines showed meticulous precision. The shading demonstrated technical expertise. The entire piece reflected significant investment of time and resources. This wasn't some hastily acquired marking. This was deliberate, carefully executed work. The permanence of the ink contrasted sharply with biological threat displays that could be retracted or concealed. This marking would remain visible until her skin decomposed. It was a permanent statement. This placement suggested a familiarity with mortality that went beyond theoretical understanding. Positioning such symbolism at the throat indicated practical knowledge of vulnerability. She had chosen to mark the exact point where her life could be most easily terminated. The message wasn't just about accepting death. It was about understanding the mechanics of it. The skull's positioning demonstrated awareness of anatomical weakness rather than attempts to conceal it. The choice represented a complete inversion of standard intimidation methodology. Most species emphasize their strong points: thick hide, reinforced plating, natural weaponry. Humans apparently mark their weakest points. They decorate their vulnerabilities rather than hiding them. This changes the entire calculation of confrontation. When your opponent proudly displays where they can be killed, it suggests they've already accepted that possibility. They've moved beyond fear of death to something more concerning: acceptance of it. The image's permanence created a continuous statement that required no energy expenditure. Unlike bioluminescent displays that drain resources or pheromone releases that require chemical production, the tattoo simply existed. It communicated threat without effort, without conscious activation. It was always on, always visible, always delivering its message. This represented an efficiency we hadn't considered in intimidation tactics. The silence in the hall deepened as cadets processed the implications. This wasn't temporary posturing. This was permanent commitment. The skull remained visible even when she breathed, the image moving with her throat's movements. It became part of her, integrated into her physical presence. The artwork quality suggested it had been there for some time, meaning she'd been carrying this message throughout the Academy's mockery. She'd been showing them who she was the entire time. They just hadn't been looking properly. Then their eyes moved to the words surrounding it. The letters wrapped around the skull in precise script, completing the message that the image alone couldn't convey. The text provided context, turning visual symbolism into explicit statement. The combination of image and text created a complete ideological package, one that would redefine how the Academy understood human psychology. The silence became absolute as reading comprehension set in. What does death before dishonor mean when wrapped around a human throat? The phrase circled her neck in clean, unadorned lettering, positioned just above the skull design. The words wrapped completely around, meeting at the back where they became invisible to frontal observation. This wasn't slogan decoration or unit identification. This was ideological commitment rendered permanent in skin. The message wasn't meant for casual reading. It required direct engagement, face-to-face confrontation to be fully visible. The placement created a disturbing duality. By marking her most vulnerable anatomical point with these specific words, she transformed a biological weakness into a philosophical statement. The throat became both warning and vulnerability simultaneously. The message declared that this physical fragility mattered less than the principles it proclaimed. The carotid artery pulsed beneath the ink, giving the words a subtle movement that emphasized their connection to living tissue rather than inert decoration. To remove these words would require removing the throat itself. The phrase wasn't applied to skin, it became part of the skin. This permanence changed the nature of the commitment. Temporary displays can be retracted. Biological threats can be concealed. This marking represented irreversible choice. She had permanently altered her body to communicate a value system. The fusion of message and medium suggested these principles weren't just beliefs, they were integrated into her physical existence. The message declared priorities that transcended individual survival. Death before dishonor establishes a hierarchy where abstract concepts outweigh biological imperatives. Most species prioritize survival above all else. Threat displays exist to preserve life through intimidation. This phrase suggested humans might value something more than continued existence. The calculation of confrontation changes dramatically when your opponent has already accepted their mortality as preferable to compromise. This redefines effective threat assessment. Traditional intimidation relies on convincing opponents that engagement will cost them more than withdrawal. But if your opponent values honor above survival, the cost calculation becomes meaningless. You cannot threaten someone with something they've already accepted. The entire framework of military psychology must adjust when facing opponents who see death as preferable to certain outcomes. The tattoo transformed from image to ideological declaration. The skull represented mortality awareness. The words defined the terms of that mortality. Together they created a complete psychological profile that contradicted every assumption the Academy had made about human capabilities. This wasn't about physical strength or biological advantage. This was about psychological positioning that made traditional threat assessment irrelevant. The silence in the hall became profound as cadets processed the implications. They weren't just looking at body art. They were reading a personal manifesto etched into living tissue. The message's permanence meant she carried this commitment at all times, during all interactions, through all the mockery they directed at her. She had been this person the entire time. They simply hadn't understood what they were seeing. Then she reached for the lip piercing. Her hand moved to her uniform pocket, retrieving a small metal object that caught the light. The movement was smooth, deliberate, perfectly controlled. She held the stud between thumb and forefinger, examining it for a moment before bringing it toward her face. This wasn't part of the tattoo revelation. This was something additional, something completing the presentation. The cadets watched, unsure what new element was being introduced to this already complex equation. Why does a metal insertion terrify combat specialists? Maya produced a small stud from her pocket, handling it with the same deliberate care someone might show a live round. The object caught the light as she turned it between thumb and forefinger. This wasn't a weapon check or equipment inspection. The action carried ceremonial weight, a ritual completion to the visual statement already made. She held the stud with precision grip, examining its placement before bringing it toward her face. The tension shifted from visual revelation to physical action. She positioned the stud against her lower lip, exactly centered beneath the nasal septum. No measuring, no hesitation. Her other hand remained steady as she applied pressure. The metal point penetrated tissue with a motion so fluid it seemed practiced. She didn't flinch. No change in breathing pattern, no muscle tension visible in her neck or shoulders. The stud slid into place as if entering prepared space. This demonstration of pain tolerance went beyond biological display. Most species show pain avoidance reflexes. Voluntary tissue penetration without reaction suggests either abnormal neurology or exceptional control. The metal flash caught overhead lighting as it settled into position. The stud's design became visible, simple surgical steel with a flat back, practical rather than decorative. This wasn't adornment chosen for appearance. This was functional hardware. The combination created a coordinated statement. The throat tattoo declared ideological commitment. The lip piercing demonstrated physical commitment. Together they represented controlled voluntary alteration for symbolic purpose. She had modified her body in ways that served no biological advantage. The changes existed solely to communicate specific values and capabilities. This redefined body modification from cosmetic choice to tactical communication. The complete presentation revealed calculated identity construction. Every element served deliberate purpose. The oversized uniform concealed until revelation became strategically valuable. The tattoo placement combined mortality awareness with value declaration. The piercing demonstrated pain tolerance and bodily control. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was decorative. Everything communicated specific information about capability and psychology. Combat specialists understand that voluntary pain acceptance changes threat calculation. An opponent who doesn't fear injury presents different problems than one who protects their physical integrity. The piercing indicated she'd already moved beyond concern for minor tissue damage. This recalibrated what might constitute effective threat or coercion. If she didn't react to self-inflicted penetration, external threats might prove equally ineffective. The ritual completeness of the act unsettled observers. This wasn't spontaneous reaction to mockery. This was prepared demonstration held in reserve for optimal impact. She had arrived with these modifications already in place, waiting for the moment when revelation would carry maximum psychological weight. The timing indicated advanced understanding of audience psychology and dramatic effect. The metal remained visible as she completed the action, a small silver point against her lip. The stud's presence created a focal point that drew attention to her mouth, emphasizing the next actions she might take. Speech, expression, even breathing became framed by this deliberate modification. The piercing transformed her face from passive canvas to active communication instrument. Then she smiled. The expression transformed her features completely, pulling the lip stud into new alignment with facial muscles. The metal moved with her flesh, becoming part of the expression rather than separate from it. The smile wasn't warm or friendly. It was all calculated sharpness and acknowledgement. The combination of permanent modifications and momentary expression created something entirely new in the Academy's experience of intimidation displays. How does a facial expression change everything? The smile transformed her face from neutral observation to active threat assessment. It didn't reach her eyes. Those remained calm, intelligent, focused. The mouth movement was all calculated sharpness. A deliberate display of teeth that suddenly seemed less like digestive apparatus and more like anatomical weaponry. The shift happened instantly without gradual transition. One moment she was observing the silent hall. The next she was assessing it through Predator's eyes. This wasn't a friendly gesture. Human smiles typically read as submissive or non-threatening across species lines. Their bared teeth lack the sharpness of carnivorous species. Their facial muscles don't produce the same tension patterns as aggression displays, but this smile was different. This was predator acknowledging prey recognition. The expression said she saw their reaction and understood its significance. She knew they'd finally understood what they were looking at. The smile created disturbing contrast with her tattoo's deadly seriousness. Death before dishonor wrapped around a skull image suggested grim commitment to abstract principles. The smile suggested she enjoyed that commitment. It wasn't just endurance of difficult choices, it was pleasure in demonstrating them. The combination became psychologically complex in ways most intimidation displays avoid. Traditional threat signals emphasize singular messages. Back off, I'm dangerous, I will attack. This communicated layered meanings that required processing time. The permanent modifications combined with momentary expression to create something entirely new in intimidation methodology. The tattoo and piercing represented long-term decisions, irreversible changes to her physical form. The smile was temporary, situational, responsive. Together they demonstrated both permanent commitment and immediate tactical adjustment. She wasn't just someone who believed in certain principles, she was someone who enjoyed applying them in real time. She took visible pleasure in the demonstration, not mockery or superiority, but professional satisfaction. The expression suggested an artist appreciating their work's impact, or an engineer observing a precisely calibrated mechanism functioning as intended. This emotional component added disturbing depth to the psychological display. Threat becomes more concerning when the threatener appears to be enjoying themselves. The smile became the final piece of the psychological display because it activated everything that came before. The uniform unzipping, the tattoo revelation, the piercing insertion, all gained new meaning through this facial expression. It framed the entire sequence as intentional theater, rather than accidental revelation. She had planned this moment, prepared for it, and now appreciated its execution. Her eyes remained the most unsettling element. While her mouth displayed teeth, her gaze stayed calm and analytical. This created cognitive dissonance for observers. The smile suggested emotional engagement while the eyes demonstrated detached assessment. She was simultaneously reacting to and evaluating the room's response. This dual consciousness suggested advanced psychological capabilities beyond simple threat projection. The expression's effectiveness lay in its calculated nature. This wasn't spontaneous emotion leaking through control. Every muscle movement appeared deliberate, practiced, intentional. The smile wasn't something that happened to her face, it was something she did with her face. This level of physical control implied corresponding mental discipline. An opponent who controls their facial expressions that precisely likely controls other things with equal precision. Then she explained what they were seeing. Her voice emerged calm and measured, the lip stud moving slightly with her articulation. The tone contradicted the deadly seriousness of her visual presentation. She sounded like someone discussing technical specifications rather than delivering a psychological revelation. This dissonance between content and delivery style made the message more impactful. The words would define intimidation in entirely new terms. What psychological warfare principle did she demonstrate? Maya spoke conversationally, like someone commenting on atmospheric conditions rather than delivering a strategic revelation. Her tone remained even, measured, almost clinical. The contrast between her calm delivery and the deadly seriousness of her visual presentation created cognitive dissonance for the audience. She wasn't posturing or performing. She was explaining fundamental concepts as if they were basic tactical principles everyone should already understand. She defined intimidation not as threat projection, but as transparency. The display showed exactly what humans value and what they'll sacrifice to protect those values. This reversed the entire concept of intimidation from bluff to commitment demonstration. Traditional threat displays rely on convincing opponents you might cause harm. Her approach demonstrated she'd already accepted harm as preferable to certain outcomes. The calculation shifted from evaluating capability to understanding willingness. This changes threat assessment fundamentally. Instead of measuring physical capabilities, arm count, weapon quality, biological advantages, it becomes about understanding value systems. You stop asking, "Can they hurt me?" and start asking, "Will they choose to?" The first question involves comparing measurable factors. The second requires psychological profiling and cultural understanding. It's a completely different evaluation framework. Intimidation becomes about revealing willingness rather than capability. Willingness is harder to measure but more reliable once demonstrated. Capability can be faked or exaggerated. Willingness, when proven through permanent modifications and demonstrated pain tolerance, becomes undeniable fact. This creates a more stable deterrent because it doesn't require constant energy expenditure to maintain the threat perception. The effectiveness lies in its psychological transparency. She wasn't hiding her capabilities or intentions. She was displaying them openly. This approach works across species because it relies on universal concepts: mortality, pain, value prioritization. You don't need to understand Xanthari bioluminescent patterns or Retharian sonic vibrations to understand someone who marks their most vulnerable point with death imagery. The method requires no ongoing energy expenditure beyond the initial commitment. Traditional threat displays drain resources, chemical production for pheromones, metabolic energy for bioluminescence, physical effort for posturing. Her approach worked continuously without conscious effort. The tattoo and piercing communicated even when she slept. The commitment was always active, always present, always delivering its message. This represents a tactical innovation the Academy hadn't anticipated. Military training focuses on projecting strength and concealing weakness. Her demonstration showed that revealing weakness with the right framing can become greater strength. By marking her vulnerability, she transformed it into psychological advantage. The throat became both warning and statement rather than just anatomical weakness. The silence in the hall indicated perfect understanding. No questions, no challenges, no attempts to reclaim dominance through traditional displays. The cadets recognized they were witnessing something that invalidated their existing evaluation methods. Their laughter didn't return because the joke had fundamentally changed. They weren't looking at a fragile human anymore. They were looking at someone who'd already accepted outcomes they themselves still feared. However, this was only the beginning. The psychological demonstration redefined how they saw human capabilities, but practical applications would follow. The Academy would soon discover that human tactical thinking extended far beyond intimidation methods. Their approach to actual combat situations would further de-infoo established military doctrines. The real surprise wasn't just how humans communicated threat. It was how they operationalized violence when communication failed. Why couldn't they meet her gaze? The silence became physical, a weight pressing down on the assembled cadets that felt heavier than atmospheric containment fields. Previously boastful individuals now studied floor patterns with intense interest, their multiple eyes tracing the grout lines between deck plates as if discovering profound cosmic secrets there. The Retharian, who'd been flexing his acid glands minutes earlier, now kept his frill tightly compressed. The Xanthari observer, who'd been running bioluminescent threat patterns, now maintained neutral gray epidermis. Every cadet found something suddenly fascinating about their own limbs, equipment, or immediate surroundings, anything but meeting the human's calm assessment. The absence of sound became more powerful than any roar or threat display. In that hall designed for acoustic amplification of dominance challenges, the complete lack of vocalization carried its own message. You could hear cooling systems cycling, distant machinery operating, individual respiratory patterns. The normal background hum of species-specific communications had vanished entirely. This wasn't paused conversation, it was terminated conversation. The silence didn't feel temporary. It felt like a new, permanent condition. Cadets realized they'd been evaluating the wrong metrics entirely. Their assessment frameworks had measured limb count, biological weaponry, traditional intimidation displays. They'd been scoring each other on how effectively they projected species-specific threats. The human had demonstrated something outside their evaluation parameters entirely. She hadn't shown greater physical capability. She'd shown greater psychological commitment. This wasn't something their scanners could quantify or their instructors had trained them to recognize. Their own displays now seemed childish compared to her quiet commitment. The bioluminescent patterns suddenly looked like decorative lighting rather than combat readiness indicators. The multi-limb posturing appeared as unnecessary theatrics. The pheromone releases seemed like chemical overcompensation, where their intimidation required constant energy expenditure and conscious effort. Hers worked passively, continuously, without any apparent drain on her resources. Their methods were performances. Hers was a state of being. The hierarchy of respect underwent instantaneous recalibration. Positions established through cycles of dominance challenges and physical demonstrations became immediately irrelevant. The Retharian sector commander, the Xanthari drill coordinator, the Crevian tactical lead, all found themselves repositioned in a new psychological landscape they didn't understand. Social standing based on physical superiority meant nothing when facing someone who demonstrated indifference to physical outcomes. Even I felt my initial assessment crumbling beneath this new evidence. Corex, Xanthari Observer, third-class intelligence liaison. I'd documented humans as borderline cases, physically inadequate for frontline service. My reports emphasized their biological limitations, their lack of traditional threat capabilities. Now I recognized I'd been measuring the wrong indicators entirely. They weren't deficient in intimidation methodology. They'd developed a completely different system. One that worked across species lines without translation. One that required no energy expenditure beyond initial commitment. One that made our traditional displays look primitive by comparison. The laughter didn't return because the joke had become the joke tellers. They'd been laughing at what they perceived as human weakness. Now they understood the weakness had been in their own perception. The humor had reversed direction, and nobody wanted to be the first to acknowledge they'd completely misread an entire species' capabilities. The silence persisted because breaking it would require admitting fundamental error in their threat assessment protocols. Then the instructors began taking notes. Their monitoring station showed increased activity as they documented the interaction. Scanners focused on Maya's vital signs, searching for physiological tells that might explain the psychological impact. Evaluation systems recalibrated to account for this new intimidation methodology. The Academy's teaching protocols were being rewritten in real time, their assumptions about military capability undergoing drastic revision. Why did instructors call her methods innovative? Because they'd never seen intimidation work like that before. They observed from their monitoring stations, fingers already moving across their consoles recording the interaction. Their scoring systems weren't designed to evaluate this type of display. They had metrics for bioluminescent intensity, sonic projection range, pheromone concentration levels. They had nothing for psychological projection through body modification and controlled revelation. The system simply didn't have categories for what they were witnessing. They recognized she'd demonstrated a combat principle beyond physical confrontation. This wasn't about overpowering opponents through strength or biological advantage. It was about bypassing physical engagement entirely, by shifting the conflict to psychological terrain. The instructors saw she hadn't matched traditional intimidation displays. She'd made them irrelevant. She changed the rules of engagement without firing a shot or extending a limb. Her method required no energy expenditure beyond the initial commitment. The tattoo and piercing worked continuously without conscious effort. Unlike bioluminescent displays that drain metabolic resources or pheromone releases that require chemical production, her intimidation operated passively. It communicated threat even when she slept, trained, or performed routine tasks. This represented incredible efficiency in psychological warfare operations. It worked across species without translation or cultural context. The skull imagery translated universally. The throat placement communicated vulnerability understood by any species with circulatory systems. The pain tolerance demonstration needed no explanation. Instructors recognized they were observing something that functioned outside specific biological or cultural frameworks. This made it applicable in any interspecies engagement scenario. The effectiveness lies in its simplicity and universality. Complex threat displays can be misinterpreted across species lines. A bioluminescent pattern that means lethal intent to Xanthari might read as mating display to another species. Her approach used fundamental concepts, mortality, vulnerability, voluntary pain acceptance, that translate without cultural baggage. The message was too basic to be misread. This represents a tactical innovation they hadn't anticipated from humans. The Academy expected humans to either adopt existing intimidation methods or develop enhanced versions of traditional displays. They didn't anticipate a complete reinvention of intimidation methodology. The instructors saw they weren't just observing a new technique, they were witnessing a new warfare dimension entirely. The Academy system must adapt to account for this new warfare dimension. Evaluation protocols need rewriting. Training simulations require new parameters. Threat assessment algorithms need recalibration. The entire framework for measuring combat effectiveness requires expansion beyond physical capabilities to include psychological warfare efficiency. This isn't adding a new category, it's creating a new evaluation system entirely. However, this was only the beginning of her demonstrations. The intimidation display proved humans understood psychological warfare principles. The upcoming combat exercises would demonstrate they understood tactical innovation as well. The Academy would soon discover that human strategic thinking extended far beyond communication methods. Their approach to actual engagement would further de-enfu established military doctrines. The real surprise wasn't just how humans communicated threat, it was how they operationalized violence when communication failed. Then the maintenance shaft incident occurred during the next combat simulation. Red Team fortified traditional access points expecting frontal assault or aerial insertion. They prepared for standard Academy tactics, overwhelming force through established channels. They didn't consider the spaces between the defenses, the pathways everyone else considered irrelevant to combat operations. Maya accessed maintenance schematics and identified routes others had overlooked entirely. How did shafts defeat firepower? During the orbital assault simulation, Red Team fortified every traditional access point with textbook precision. They established overlapping fields of fire at main corridors, positioned sniper teams at observation decks, and set proximity alerts at all primary entry vectors. They expected frontal assault through established channels or aerial insertion from deployment bays. These were standard Academy tactics, the kind drilled into every cadet from their first cycle. The team leader even allocated extra resources to reinforce the command center's main entrance, confident that any attack would come through predictable pathways. Maya Torres, assigned to Blue Team's reconnaissance unit, accessed maintenance schematics instead of weapon inventories. She studied the station's internal infrastructure with focused intensity, identifying service corridors and environmental control pathways that didn't appear on tactical displays. These weren't combat routes, they were forgotten spaces for repair crews and maintenance drones. Most cadets never noticed them except as background features of station life. She recognized them as strategic arteries hidden in plain sight. The shafts became her primary infiltration network. While Red Team monitored conventional approaches, she moved through spaces others considered irrelevant to combat operations. Maintenance access points became insertion vectors. Environmental control tunnels became movement corridors. Service hatches became ambush positions. She redefined the battlefield beyond expected engagement zones, treating the entire station as potential terrain rather than just the designated combat areas. Her team emerged, where Red Team's defenses were weakest precisely because those points were considered undefendable or unimportant. They didn't breach reinforced doors. They entered through ventilation maintenance ports. They didn't assault fortified positions. They appeared behind them through service access panels. The defenders found themselves attacked from directions their tactical planning had never considered. Their superior firepower became irrelevant when the engagement occurred outside their prepared positions. Victory came through redefinition of terrain rather than superior force. Blue Team achieved objectives with minimal casualties because they fought in spaces Red Team hadn't thought to protect. The simulation revealed that assumptions about military facilities created critical vulnerabilities. Every station was designed with defensive parameters based on known species' physical limitations and tactical doctrines. Humans operated outside those parameters entirely. The maintenance shaft approach demonstrated a fundamental shift in tactical thinking. Where other species sought to overwhelm defenses through superior strength or technology, humans sought to bypass them through environmental exploitation. They didn't need better weapons, they needed better understanding of infrastructure. Their advantage came not from breaking through defenses but from moving around them entirely. This tactic represented more than just clever infiltration. It showed humans viewed military installations differently. They saw potential combat zones where others saw only architectural features. Their physical size and flexibility allowed access to areas station designers never considered tactical vulnerabilities. This created opportunities that larger, more biologically specialized species consistently overlooked. The simulation's outcome forced immediate reassessment of defensive protocols. Instructors recognized that traditional fortification strategies had critical blind spots when facing opponents who redefined engagement parameters. Security teams began reviewing all station schematics for previously ignored access points. Maintenance tunnels suddenly became priority defensive considerations rather than afterthoughts. Then Vex 12 made his fatal miscalculation. Confident in his physical superiority and traditional combat training, he challenged Maya privately after the simulation. He believed her success came from technical trickery rather than actual tactical superiority. He expected to demonstrate real military effectiveness through direct confrontation, certain that physical dominance would prevail where defensive planning had failed. What tactical advantage did body language provide? Vex 12 challenged Maya privately in an empty training bay, confident in his physical superiority. He stood nearly 2 meters tall with reinforced carapace and 6 limbs capable of independent striking motions. His species specialized in overpowering force applications, and he topped his class in close-quarters combat evaluations. He expected to demonstrate what he considered real military tactics through direct physical domination. The confrontation would reaffirm traditional hierarchy through established methods. Maya read micro-expressions and muscle tensions before movement initiation. She didn't wait for his attack. She observed the subtle tightening around his visual receptors, the slight shift in his primary limb positioning, the almost imperceptible leaning forward that preceded aggressive action. Her assessment wasn't about reacting to movement but anticipating intention. She operated in the space between his decision to act and his body's execution of that decision. This gave her a temporal advantage measured in fractions of seconds. Her movements were economical, precise, and targeted at disabling rather than destroying. She didn't attempt to match his strength or engage in prolonged struggle. Instead, she used his forward momentum against him, redirecting his charge with minimal force application. Her strikes targeted neural clusters and pressure points that temporarily disrupted motor function. Each motion served specific purpose without wasted effort. She moved with fluid precision that made every action seem effortless despite its effectiveness. The encounter lasted 4 seconds because that was all the time required. From initial movement to neutralization, the entire engagement occupied less time than most species take to process threat assessments. Vex found himself immobilized before he fully understood the engagement had begun. His physical advantages became irrelevant when he couldn't apply them effectively. The speed of resolution demonstrated that combat efficiency isn't about movement velocity, but action timing. Vex experienced not just defeat, but comprehensive outmaneuvering. He wasn't simply overpowered, he was systematically dismantled. His training emphasized force meeting force, strength against strength. Her approach bypassed his strengths entirely, attacking his operational capacity rather than testing his durability. The outcome suggested his entire combat methodology might be fundamentally flawed against this type of opposition. He wasn't just beaten, he was conceptually outmatched. Speed became about anticipation timing rather than movement velocity. She didn't move faster than his limbs could strike. She moved before they began striking. Her advantage came from processing his intentions and acting during his decision execution gap. This represents a different kind of speed that traditional combat metrics don't measure. It's cognitive velocity rather than physical quickness, and it changes how effective engagement time gets calculated. Then she delivered the warning that redefined everything. Standing over the immobilized cadet, she didn't gloat or posture. She offered analysis in the same calm tone she'd used in the academy hall. Her words distinguished between violence and tactics, explaining that the former was just one tool, while the latter encompassed all engagement methodology. She repositioned physical confrontation as merely one option among many, and not necessarily the most effective one in all situations. The lesson extended beyond the immediate defeat to challenge fundamental military assumptions. Why aren't they the same thing? Maya stood over Vex, her sidearm still holstered, her posture relaxed. The weapon was available but not employed. She made no move to draw it, no gesture toward further engagement. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers loose. She had neutralized the threat without escalating to lethal force. The option for violence existed, but she chose analysis instead. This distinction became the core of her lesson. She offered assessment rather than additional confrontation. Her voice remained level, analytical, detached from the physical tension of moments before. She wasn't gloating or threatening. She was instructing. The tone suggested professional critique rather than personal victory. She treated the encounter as a learning opportunity rather than a dominance demonstration. This approach confused Vex more than any physical technique could have. She distinguished between the application of force and the strategy governing it. Force was just one possible action within a broader tactical framework. Strategy determined when to use it, how much to apply, and what alternatives might achieve better results with fewer resources. She explained that violence should serve tactical objectives rather than define them. This perspective reframed military effectiveness from physical capability to decision-making quality. Violence became just one tool among many, not the definition of tactics. Information control, psychological manipulation, terrain exploitation, timing and resource allocation all offered pathways to victory. Physical confrontation represented the least efficient option in most scenarios. She emphasized that successful operations minimize resource expenditure while maximizing objective achievement. This efficiency principle redefined how military success should be measured. Good soldiers understand violence. Great strategists understand when not to use it. The ability to recognize non-violent solutions often demonstrates greater military aptitude than proficiency in combat. She pointed out that Vex's immediate resort to physical challenge reflected tactical immaturity rather than strength. True capability involved selecting the most effective method for each situation, not defaulting to familiar patterns. This perspective elevates combat from physical contest to intellectual exercise. The real battle occurs in the planning and decision-making phases rather than the engagement itself. Success depends more on cognitive processes than physical performance. She explained that human training emphasizes situation assessment, option evaluation, and consequence prediction. Physical skills support these mental processes rather than replace them. Vex's mistake was conflating the method with the purpose. He believed military excellence meant superior combat performance. She clarified that military excellence means achieving objectives with minimal losses. The purpose isn't to fight well but to win efficiently. This fundamental misunderstanding explained why traditional species often misjudged human capabilities. They were measuring the wrong indicators entirely. The warning redefined military excellence as cognitive rather than physical. Strategic thinking, anticipation, and decision-making under pressure became the valued skills. Physical prowess mattered only as it served larger tactical purposes. This shift in evaluation criteria explained why humans performed unexpectedly well in simulations. They weren't stronger or faster. They were smarter about engagement selection and execution. However, her background revealed even deeper implications. This wasn't just personal philosophy or individual skill. This represented systematic training in asymmetric warfare and psychological operations. Her approach reflected institutional doctrine rather than personal innovation. The humans hadn't arrived to learn galactic military methods. They'd come to study how to apply their own methods against alien psychology. This suggested a much larger strategic agenda than simple military integration. Why is her training unsettling to galactic civilization? Maya's dossier revealed specialization in asymmetric warfare and psychological operations, not standard combat training. This wasn't about learning to fight better. It was about learning to influence behavior differently. The discovery shifted how we understood human military development. They hadn't been trying to match our capabilities. They'd been developing completely different ones. She didn't come to learn alien tactics, she came to understand alien psychology. Her study focus wasn't weapon systems or combat techniques. It was behavioral patterns, decision-making processes, cultural triggers. While other cadets trained in marksmanship and physical conditioning, she studied interspecies communication models and psychological vulnerability mapping. The Academy Exchange program became intelligence gathering for strategic positioning rather than skill acquisition. Her studies focus on how to influence behavior, not just defeat forces. This represents a fundamental shift from conquest to shaping outcomes. Traditional military thinking involves defeating opponents through force application. Her training emphasized redirecting opponents through psychological manipulation and environmental control. The goal isn't to win battles, but to prevent them from occurring in the first place by controlling the conditions that lead to conflict. The Academy Exchange program became intelligence gathering for strategic positioning. Every interaction provided data on alien behavior under stress, competitive situations, and hierarchical challenges. Human observers documented how different species responded to various stimuli, building psychological profiles that could inform future engagement strategies. This wasn't cultural exchange. It was tactical research conducted under diplomatic cover. Humans aren't just another species seeking inclusion, they're studying how to lead. Their approach suggests they see themselves as future architects of galactic civilization, rather than participants in existing structures. This represents long-term planning beyond immediate military concerns. They're playing a different game with different objectives and different timeframes for achievement. This suggests sophisticated, patient approach to galactic integration. They're not seeking quick victories or territorial gains. They're building comprehensive understanding of how multiple species think, react, and organize. This knowledge provides foundation for influencing galactic development patterns over decades or centuries rather than seeking immediate tactical advantages. Her presence indicates systematic preparation rather than individual capability. The skills she demonstrated weren't personal innovations, they reflected institutional training protocols. This means Earth's military structures have been developing these methodologies for some time, possibly anticipating eventual contact with multiple alien species. They arrived prepared with strategies specifically designed for interspecies engagement. The unsettling aspect lies in the complete paradigm shift. Galactic military doctrine developed around physical capabilities and technological advantages. Human strategy focuses on psychological understanding and information control. They're not trying to beat us at our game. They're playing a different game entirely with rules we don't fully understand yet. This creates strategic vulnerability because we're measuring the wrong indicators. Then she explained the ultimate purpose during a private conversation in the observation deck. Her tone remained conversational, but the content revealed strategic thinking that spanned generations rather than combat cycles. She described human approach not as conquest but as civilization shaping, with military capability serving as insurance rather than primary tool. This redefined how we understood their presence in galactic affairs. How could diplomacy reshape cosmic power? In quiet conversation hours later, Maya revealed human strategic thinking with the same calm precision she'd shown in combat. We stood in an observation deck overlooking the Academy's orbital ring, the planet turning slowly beneath us. She spoke without dramatic emphasis, her words carrying more weight for their lack of theatrical delivery. The revelation wasn't presented as threat or boast, just factual assessment of long-term policy. Conquest is inefficient compared to shaping civilizations to compatible development. She explained that controlling territory requires constant resource expenditure, garrisons, supply lines, occupation forces. Shaping development through influence and cooperation creates self-sustaining systems that align with human interests without ongoing military commitment. This approach recognizes that voluntary alignment lasts longer than forced compliance and costs significantly less to maintain. Humans seek to guide rather than control, to influence rather than occupy. Their method involves building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than domination. They share knowledge and technology to create interdependence, making cooperation more profitable than conflict. This isn't altruism. It's strategic investment in stable galactic development. They're playing the long game, measured in centuries rather than combat cycles. Violence capability exists only to ensure diplomacy remains the preferred option. Military strength serves as insurance policy rather than primary tool. The demonstrated willingness to protect interests makes other species more inclined to negotiate rather than test boundaries. This creates stability through deterrence while leaving diplomatic channels open for cooperation. The threat of force makes its actual use unnecessary in most scenarios. This makes humans not conquerors but architects of civilization. They're not interested in ruling over other species, but in shaping how those species develop. Their approach focuses on creating systems and structures that naturally align with human values and interests. This represents a fundamental shift from traditional expansion models to developmental influence models. Their strength ensures their vision gets heard, not necessarily imposed. Other species must consider human perspectives because ignoring them carries demonstrated risks. This creates a position of influence rather than control. Humans don't demand compliance. They make their case from a position of respected capability. The combination of strategic insight and defensive willingness commands attention in diplomatic forums. The galaxy becomes a system to be optimized, not territory to be claimed. Human strategy treats interstellar relations as a complex network to be managed, rather than property to be acquired. They analyze civilizational development patterns, resource flows, and cultural evolution. Their interventions aim to guide these systems toward stability and compatibility, rather than seizing control of them. This represents an evolutionary step in interstellar relations. Previous expansion models involved physical control and direct domination. Human strategy focuses on psychological influence and systematic development. They've moved beyond conquest to civilization shaping, using military capability to secure diplomatic progress rather than replace it. However, the implications unsettle everyone who understands them. This approach represents a form of influence that's harder to detect and counter than traditional military expansion. Physical borders can be defended. Ideological and cultural influence operates through less visible channels. The realization that humans are playing a completely different strategic game creates profound unease among species that still think in terms of territorial control and military dominance. The Council's original miscalculation becomes clear in this new light. They thought they were integrating a new species into existing galactic structures. Instead, they were providing that species with perfect observation points to study how to reshape those structures. The invitation might have been the greatest strategic error in galactic history, giving humans access to precisely the psychological and cultural information they needed to implement their long-term civilization-shaping strategies. What did they misunderstand about human intentions? Everything. The Galactic Council admitted humans to study and integrate them, following standard protocol for new species introduction. They assumed humans would adapt to existing galactic norms and structures, learning our combat methods and adopting our evaluation systems. The invitation came with expectations of cultural assimilation, the gradual smoothing of rough edges until humans fit comfortably within established frameworks. This assumption reflected centuries of successful species integration patterns. Instead, humans are studying how to reshape those norms to human advantage. The Academy became a laboratory for human psychological and strategic research, rather than an educational institution. Every interaction provided data on alien behavior and decision-making patterns. Classroom discussions revealed thought processes. Training exercises exposed tactical assumptions. Social interactions mapped psychological responses to various stimuli. Humans collected this information systematically, building comprehensive profiles of every species they encountered. The Council thought they were integrating a new species. They were hosting strategists. This reversal of expectations created massive strategic vulnerability. While we measured their physical capabilities and traditional combat performance, they measured our psychological thresholds and cultural vulnerabilities. They weren't learning to fight like us, they were learning how to fight us. The entire exchange program became intelligence-gathering operations under diplomatic cover. The invitation might have been the greatest strategic error in galactic history. We provided them complete access to our military training methods, tactical doctrines, and psychological profiles. 3 full rotations of observation gave them everything they needed to understand how to influence or counter every major species in the Council. They studied us like specimens while we evaluated them as potential recruits. The power dynamic was completely inverted from what we intended. Then I realized what was truly happening. The pieces came together slowly at first. The unusual study patterns, the specific questions they asked, the particular interactions they sought out. They weren't random behaviors. They formed coherent intelligence-gathering patterns. Humans focused on understanding decision-making processes rather than memorizing tactical manuals. They prioritized psychological profiling over weapons proficiency. Their approach was systematic, methodical, and frighteningly comprehensive. They weren't just another species joining the galactic community. They were architects preparing to redesign that community. Their questions revealed strategic thinking that spanned generations rather than combat cycles. They asked about historical conflicts not to understand military tactics, but to analyze cultural responses to stress. They inquired about governmental structures not to integrate, but to identify leverage points. Every conversation served multiple purposes beyond surface-level communication. The Council's vulnerability became terrifyingly clear. We had given our most likely future competitors complete access to our weaknesses, our thought patterns, our psychological triggers. They understood us better than we understood ourselves because they studied us with clinical detachment, while we studied them through prejudiced frameworks. Our evaluation systems were designed to measure physical threats, not psychological ones. This wasn't cultural exchange. This was strategic reconnaissance on a civilizational scale. The humans played the role of eager students so effectively that we never questioned their motives. We measured their test scores and physical performance while they mapped our cognitive patterns and decision-making trees. The asymmetry of understanding became the real threat, not any physical capability difference. Then I understood the throat tattoo revelation wasn't just personal intimidation. It was data collection. She was testing our responses to unconventional psychological warfare methods. The silence in that hall provided more valuable intelligence than any combat simulation. She learned exactly how different species react to completely new forms of threat presentation. That information would inform human psychological operations for decades to come. The Academy had become a human laboratory, and we were the specimens being studied. Our arrogance in assuming we were the teachers blinded us to the fact we'd become the subject matter. The humans weren't here to learn our ways. They were here to learn how to influence our ways. The entire power structure of galactic relations was shifting beneath our feet, and we were too busy evaluating limb counts to notice. What makes humans predators without claws? I reconsidered everything I thought about predator ecology, watching Maya move through the Academy's corridors afterward. The other cadets gave her space without being asked, their body language showing deference we normally reserve for species with obvious physical advantages. Their reactions weren't based on visible weaponry or biological threat displays. They were responding to demonstrated capability that operated outside our traditional evaluation frameworks. Apex status isn't about physical dominance, but strategic positioning. Humans dominate through cognitive advantage and long-term planning that makes physical confrontation unnecessary in most scenarios. Their strength lies in anticipating conflicts before they occur and shaping conditions to avoid them entirely. This represents a complete redefinition of predation from force application to situation control. They don't need to be the strongest species in the room. They need to be the smartest. They've defined the battlefield as the future itself, not any physical space. Their operations focus on influencing development patterns and decision-making processes, years or decades before actual engagement might occur. This temporal advantage makes traditional military planning seem reactive and short-sighted. While we prepare for possible conflicts, they're engineering scenarios where conflict becomes unlikely or unnecessary through careful preparation and influence. Their weapons are ideas, strategies, and psychological understandings rather than physical instruments. They fight with information control, cultural manipulation, and behavioral influence. These tools work across species lines without translation and operate continuously without resource expenditure. A well-placed idea can achieve more than a battalion of shock troops without risking a single life or expending significant resources. This makes them more dangerous than any physically dominant species. Because their methods are harder to detect and counter, you can fortify against physical attacks. Psychological and strategic influence operates through subtler channels that traditional defenses don't address. Their approach creates vulnerabilities in areas we haven't thought to protect because we didn't recognize them as battlefields. The most terrifying predators are those who change the rules of predation. Humans don't play by established galactic conflict protocols. They've developed completely new engagement methodologies that bypass traditional defenses and evaluation systems. Their historical records read like instruction manuals for redefining combat parameters rather than following them. This represents evolutionary adaptation in warfare methodology. Humans aren't just another species. They're an evolutionary force. Their presence forces re-evaluation of fundamental assumptions about power, conflict, and civilization development. They're not trying to win within existing systems. They're changing the systems themselves to ones where their particular capabilities provide maximum advantage. This isn't adaptation, it's transformation of the entire environment. Then the video ends where it began, with silence. The same profound quiet that followed Maya's collar unzipping now fills the observation deck as I process these realizations. The silence isn't absence of sound but presence of understanding. It's the quiet that comes when established certainties collapse and new realities must be confronted. The Academy continues its operations below, cadets moving through routines that suddenly seem outdated and inadequate. The humans move among them, studying, learning, preparing. Their quiet presence now feels more significant than any dramatic display of force. The most dangerous threats aren't the ones that roar, but the ones that make you stop and reconsider everything you thought you knew about power and predation. The silence after her reveal wasn't absence of sound. It was presence of understanding. We'd been measuring claws and counting limbs while they mapped our psychological terrain. Remember that the most dangerous threats aren't the ones that roar, but the ones that make you stop laughing. True power doesn't announce itself. It waits for the perfect moment to demonstrate it. What happens when the entire galaxy realizes it's been studied by the species it underestimated? The joke's trajectory reverses. The observers become the observed. The evaluators find themselves evaluated. The laughter stops everywhere when you realize who's been taking notes.